Welcome to Pathways to Greatness, where we explore the journeys of exceptional individuals who have achieved remarkable success in their fields. Whether you're an aspiring athlete, a business leader, or simply someone striving to reach your full potential, this podcast is your guide to unlocking the greatness within you. Join us as we dive into inspiring stories, practical strategies, and the mindset shifts that can transform your path to greatness. Let's embark on this journey together. Hey, welcome to Pathways to Greatness podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Forrester, and on today's show, I am joined by, I always mess this up. I'm joined by John Horn, and I'm very excited about this one. And John is another social media Instagram friend that we discussed. We're not even sure how we got connected, but like minds do attract one another. And I've really enjoyed the back and forth social media friendship that we've developed. And he made a post on March 14th that impacted me enough to reach out and ask him if he wanted to hop on and have a conversation. And it was about his 27th anniversary. And come to find out, John and his wife, are high school sweethearts. They met between the freshman and sophomore years in high school, and they're still together. How cool is that? I mean, that in and of itself shows what John and his wife are made of. And what you'll hear in this throughout the red thread throughout the whole episode is the importance of having a standard and sticking to that. And I wanted to talk to John about the post because it also talked about his children, and he's got adult children. And I was curious, as I'm going through fatherhood and in this transition with not adult kids, not even close, thankfully, but they're getting there. And before we know it, we blink our eye and they will be adults and on their own. And I just needed mentorship. I had questions and I wanted to tap into what John had to offer. So I hope that you enjoy this as much as I did. It's one that I'm going to listen to multiple times, but then also it's a connection that I've made with John that I know, and I hope so, and I think John would echo this, is that we've got a friendship that I'll be reaching out to him for godly fatherly advice and help along the way. So bottom line, reach out, find somebody that can help you that's further along than you are. So ladies and gentlemen, John Horn. Good. Well, everybody, welcome back to the show. Today, John Horn joins the show. There it goes.
Great. Thanks.
That wasn't super eloquent to get started, but that's what it is.
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, this is great. So John and I have been following back and forth with each other on Instagram. I don't know how long now. Do you know?
Man, it may be reaching a couple years now.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah.
Do you remember where we first got connected?
I do not. So, mean, obviously we follow quite a few of the same people. And I think maybe, throughout that course, one thing led to another, and yeah, it was just like I'll say a mutual attraction, if you will. Your son plays, obviously, football, and daughter volleyball, I believe. And, mine did as well. So I think that was a mutual attraction as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's another success story of social media. So many of us, even me, I roll my eyes when you hear social media and you hear this and that. And I just have to say is that since I got on Instagram, I've had more amazing friendships develop that I never in a million years, like our paths would have never crossed without Instagram.
No. Yeah. Usually that's where, because of Instagram, obviously we find each other on Facebook, and, and again, one thing led to another on that front. But yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. Well, John, before we get started, because I've got some good questions, I play a game called Would You Rather. You ready?
Shoot.
Okay. Would you rather go forward 100 years or go back 100 years?
I would probably like to go back.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I would like to go back. Just because of, history and, just some, maybe some historical curiosities, if you will. So, yeah, I think back.
How long would you want to spend if you went back?
Maybe long enough for it to be painful. And when I say that, because obviously, we have uh, the social medias and all the, fancy cars and the phones and all that stuff. And, I would just like to, get an idea of, what it was like, you know, um, whether it was, growing up in, hard times or obviously different times than what we have now. But yeah, I think back. Yeah.
And I like the way that you phrase that in the sense of as long as it takes it to become painful, because you don't know what that would be. Because I've had some people is like, I want to go back for 5 years because that's a commitment to go
Sure.
back for that long to
Sure.
see. And you never know. You may love it. Simpler times create simple
100%.
people,
Yeah,
but they all have their own hardships as well. So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
okay. Next question. Would you rather always know the right answer or always make the right decision?
That's a toughie. Um, Maybe make the right decision.
Okay.
I could probably go either way on that. Because even if you know it, does that mean that you're going to use that to your benefit? Yeah, maybe make the right decision because we don't,
Yeah. And
we,
yeah,
a lot of times we don't make the right decisions, right?
even
So
when we know the right answer,
even when we know the right answer, yeah, for sure.
I, I would say more times than not, the bad decisions I have made, it's when I've known that I'm going against what the right decision
Sure.
and the right answer would be.
Yeah. Yeah. That gut feeling, or, that, you feel like you know, the Lord has moved you in a certain way and you're like, yeah, but I'm still going to hammer down on this and it be, way off course.
Yeah.
So yeah, for
And then
sure.
we're surprised when it doesn't go our way.
Yeah. Yeah, we are.
That's the other challenge. Okay. So would you rather have pizza or tacos?
I have to say pizza because my wife is a pizza buff. So it would probably be pizza.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm
Do you
more
have a
the meat lover supreme type. And, but yeah, I'm all about meat lovers pizza. Yeah.
okay.
I like the Canadian bacon and the loaded up with the sausage and all that good stuff. So yeah, pizza for sure.
Now, do you have a particular place that you guys like to frequent?
Honestly, I don't know if if you're familiar with the Casey's, Casey's pizza, but we do like Casey's pizza. So that's basically just a general store, around the area. But obviously, Pizza Hut. Then there's a local place called Joe's, and then DiMaggio's, I believe is the name, in a town close to us. But yeah, they make the big, wagon wheel type pizzas. They're just huge.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, yeah, I'm
I
all about
love
some pizza.
pizza. Me too. I
Yeah.
love it. You can't have too many bad pizzas. I've had some bad pizza, but
I'm,
it's
I'm,
still good.
I've been in some heavy debates over pineapple on pizza, and I'm just not buying it. I don't know where you
Yeah.
stand on that, but I don't know, man.
I'll
I'm not
do it. I have no problem.
all right.
I sometimes I like that contrast where it'll be like cold and soft, or even if it's
Sure.
hot, it's kind of just like a different texture on the pizza.
Okay.
Like I don't mind it.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not an anchovy guy. I'm
Okay.
definitely not an anchovy guy.
We've had a few. So there's a local place here in town again, Alonji's. Man, it's a family ran business for years. I don't know how, we're probably going back, maybe 100 years or so. And they're known for their pizzas. And, they don't even ask. One of the things, hey, I want everything on it. Anchovies is on it. So whenever you order a supreme pizza, you actually have to say, hey, hold the anchovies, or they will put them on there without even asking. So,
I
but,
guess that's the true definition of supreme.
yep, yep. So, yeah.
Okay. And then the last question, if you came with a warning label, what would it say?
Do not shake.
Oh, okay. Tell me more.
Yeah. So, there can be times where I can be emotionally driven. Yeah, I would say do not shake would be the warning label. But now, obviously, over time, I've grown, I'll say away from that and knowing what my own personal triggers are. I try to be aware of that as well. But yeah, I've been known to be get extremely emotional when shaking.
So you talked about triggers, and that's a kicker. And you talked about being self-aware. So what were some of the things that you did that helped you understand that, so then you could control that part of yourself? Because that's not easy. And I know if people are listening, they may think, oh, well, it's easy for John to say that, and maybe I'm quote unquote self-aware, but if you're not doing anything to adjust and to change
Sure.
the outburst or the
Mm-hmm.
response. So help the audience know how you manage through that.
Well, one of the so in my occupation, I went from an hourly worker, if you will, to a frontline supervisor, and it holds true, pretty much for anything and everything, right? I was promoted, for my knowledge, but not so much for my soft skills, my interpersonal skills, and that quickly became an area that I had to bridge. uh, I had to become more self-aware, because you had those triggers, whether it be conversation with um, people that work for you or that work with you, or even just your family, you know. So, um, being aware of those triggers, became very important. It became important on building relationships. You know, sometimes if you're not, self-aware, or if you're not aware of the different triggers that trigger you, man, sometimes it's tough to build some relationships. Because you're deemed unapproachable. Um, you know, can't talk to you, type of stuff. And those were labels that was also warning labels, if you will, that were also put on me. And as I, grew older and became more and more aware of that, those are kind of painful. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, we all have feelings, you know, and it's a, um, it's an importance, in life to build relationships. And if you're not able to bridge those gaps, especially in those areas, you're going to struggle. So,
Now, do you have a system, or do you have anything in place or a routine that when you do get triggered, how you kind of keep that in control?
it's something that I work on. I'll say, I recently started following an individual, as a matter of fact, on TikTok. I found him on TikTok. You know, one of the swear words, TikTok. But again, I believe that social media can be as good as it can be bad. And he is a lawyer in Texas. And one of the things that he talks about is, hey, when someone says something that strikes a nerve, um, you know, take a deep breath, count to 10, all this type of stuff. But I would say the first initial system that I used was, the common sports phrase, if you will, and it was E plus R equals O, and just being aware of, what events do to trigger me, and, what possible outcomes, I want to come out of that event. But that's probably the biggest one. And as I looked further into it, understanding the R factor, the R factor, step one is, press pause. So, press pause, um, obviously follow, another, um, numerous other people, but, Jocko Willink, he talks about
Mm-hmm.
detachment, being able to detach from that situation. And I don't want to say that I pride myself in those situations, but, whenever they do occur, that's what I think of, hey, press pause, a quick, 5 or 10 count. And then sometimes depending on the situation, at the workplace, man, things can move quick. Or if I'm on the sideline in the middle of a football game, sometimes those things can move quick, So I've just became more and more aware, and I challenge myself to be at a steady pace. I try to be as stoic as possible, and people do say that, hey, you don't have any emotion or you don't show much emotion. And I'm like, it's because, whenever emotions get high, it's easier to kick them up than it is to try to stay as level as possible. And then if there is a pulsating, emotional trigger, it's easier to bring it back down. So that's what I found. And that's kind of what I strive to do, in those situations.
Yeah, and that's really good. Thank you for sharing that, because what I hope people heard is it's a skill. It's not just something that happens.
Oh, absolutely.
And
not.
if we allow our emotions, because our emotions will always control us unless we control them. And I'll use a David Goggins phrase, and I'll clean it up for everybody, but he would say, "Hey, brain, I win." Meaning that, you can even say, "Hey, emotions, I win," because if you can keep those in control, but you have to be aware first. And you may have heard of this, is there's an exercise that I do with athletes that I work with, and it really works with anybody on the planet, is you have traffic signals. You have a green, you're working really well, you're in the flow state, that's perfect. Then you move into that yellow, like you said, that's where you could go either way pretty easily. And then there's the red. So the whole key is, how do you stay out of those yellow and reds, limit the time in those areas and stay in the green as long as possible? Well, it all comes down to being aware and understanding, here's how I function in my perfect state. So if everything's going well, this is what I say to myself. This is the body language that I have. This is what I say to others, all of these things. And just remember, if you're not feeling like that, you're probably in the yellow moving towards the red. And the gentleman, Brian Kane, that I learned it from, he said, I realized it throughout his whole college career, he was in the yellow all the time and rarely moved into the green, and found himself more on the bottom side of the yellow because he was in the red more.
Sure.
And a lot of coaches that you've seen and handled, most people stay in that yellow and red because they don't want to latch on to that self-awareness of, I'm aware when I'm not doing well, but are you aware when you're doing well? Like, do you pay attention of how you feel and your eyes and your body language? Because other people can see that.
Yeah. And, one of the challenges too is, striving to, I was going to say control the situation, not control the situation, but be in control in the situation, and I think that's a big one as well.
Yeah, that's a big Jocko phrase of, he's like, if you're freaking out and you're in chaos mode, how can you lead people well? And how can you be the one people want to follow, is if you're going crazy and going nuts alongside of them.
I'm a firm believer in, whenever my son, whenever he was playing sports, conditioned for chaos, chaos is going to happen, we're conditioned for it, but being able to, be at a normal mindset, if you will, in that chaos, and I use that phrase, as young as he was, from the time he could talk, hey, mass chaos, control your emotions, your well-being, et cetera, et cetera. So, but yeah, for sure.
And I like how you said is that you can't control a situation, but you can be in control in a situation.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
How do you help people do that? Because if you work with students, and I know if you knew the perfect answer, you'd write a book and be a millionaire. But how do you help people figure out how to be in control in maybe an uncontrollable situation?
That's a good question. I think back to, a lot of the stories I tell obviously is around sports, whether it be coaching or, raising my son or, other athletes. And this past season, we played a rival team and, pregame, halftime, and I even purposely called a timeout with 3 minutes left to go in the game. It was a nail biter. Uh, rival, big deal, everybody knew everybody. And, but the message was, this game is going to get emotional. Be able to control your emotions, and be able to execute, you know, football's football. It's blocking and tackling and, executing and, trying to uh, be in control in those situations. Um, but I guess maybe it comes more down to just just the outcome and the personal gratification, maybe, of whenever you walk out of a high intense situation, knowing that, hey, I stayed in control, in that out of control situation. As far as teaching what that skill, because obviously it is a skill, what that looks like or to how to go about it. It's just like any other skill. You build it one day at a time, one rep at a time, and you have to constantly rep it, and that's something that we would talk about. And I'm all about, I believe in exposure. And when I say exposure, you think of the little league, baseball tournaments, the 8U, that are going into the majors next year type of stuff, those exposure tournaments, the more exposure you get to situations like that, the more you build that skill. That's just what it's like. So,
yeah, it's like the 10,000 hours in the book Outliers. You just have to put in the reps. There's no substitution
no,
for reps. None.
nope.
I mean, even like Kobe and some of these guys are crazy talented. They wouldn't have gone as far as they did, of course, with their mindset, but without the reps, it was just they knew they had to do it to the point of ad nauseum that they were going to just continue to shoot the basket, shoot the basket, shoot the basket.
Yeah. Yeah. And it comes down to, you have to understand, from a self perspective, from a self-awareness standpoint, that to change any of the habits that you have, because I'm a firm believer as well, is that I don't care what age you be, wherever you're at, on the spectrum, young, old, so forth, so on. You can always change. You can change your habits, you can change um, your situation, so forth and so on. Um, but there has to be that, reps. Whether it's, again, relating it to sports, you have your individual type, reps, and then you have your group reps, and, right, wrong, or indifferent, a lot of my reps I also, would do at home around my family, my son, my daughter, so forth and so on. And that would help me to, move along the line, if you will, moving to the next step.
Yeah. No, thank you. Well, John, I started Pathways to Greatness 3 years ago to bring people on like yourself to help others and myself learn different things that we need to get through the challenges of life. Pathways, everybody has a different path towards greatness. Everybody has a different definition of greatness. The one common factor is nobody has a straight line from point A to point B. And we have to learn, like you said, to navigate all of these. And it comes through reps. It comes through, like you said, is just having to go through that over and over. And many times, a lot of people struggle because they don't have the skills or the tactics or the understanding of how to do that. And so that's one of the things that I want to cover today. But before we do all that, what would you say your definition of greatness is?
Man, that's a good one. I'd say from an individual perspective, one that is willing to, one that is willing and able to constantly change. If you're not talking about, any per se, outcome, if you will, if you're not talking about any other attributes, just about greatness, one that is, willing and able to, and susceptible to change. Because, to become great in anything, there's a lot of changes that has to take place, whether it's internally or externally or, within the environment. So yeah, I would probably go with that.
Okay. And I really like that, because as you think, just the way you had shared, is that change is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
We're never going to avoid it. Unfortunately, many of us don't like change, and we don't manage change well. And change can be a massive trigger, emotional trigger for a lot of people. So when you see change, for you specifically, individually, when change happens, how do you approach that to be able to manage that the best way possible?
I really try to be aware of upcoming changes. Now there's been some situations obviously in my life that, has taken us by surprise. And I just always reflect back to, God's got a plan. If it's a major hiccup, a major, derailment, if you will, that's taken place in my life, or, whether it be, me, my wife, my son or daughter, is, hey, God's got a plan. And, my foundation and my faith, has always served me, good in that arena, that area. So.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And I always try to go to that, but by nature, I ruminate and I
Sure.
get stuck in something.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep telling myself about, which it's God's plan. And then the weak human side of me is, I just, please reveal your plan, when it probably is revealing as we speak. I just don't have the mental capacity, because I want it to go a different way. And there was a gentleman, and he put it up, and I'm going to absolutely butcher it. So I'll try. So it won't be exact, but it was that you can't hear the voice of God because you're talking too much. And it's that,
Yep.
that moment where we have a plan of the way we want it. We have expectations, and disappointment always happens when expectations aren't met,
Yeah.
realistic or unrealistic. But we don't have the ability to see what God's plan is. And I know for me, that's when I get frustrated.
Yeah. For me personally, I try not to expect, how would I put that into words? I don't know if there's a good way, but I try not to expect or something of a great magnitude. There's been times, trying to think of some recent activities. So my daughter, my daughter is a great example. So she grew up. She wasn't the most athletic individual, but she was fairly tall. So we tried to encourage her to play, basketball, volleyball, sports like that. So middle school she did. So she graduated, moved into high school, and after, or actually about mid to late in her freshman volleyball season, man, she was really starting to fall in love with the sport. She's really starting to work. She was getting more playing time. It's at a different level, and she started having some issues with her knees. And I'm excited because I like sports, and I wanted her to play a sport. And, so, we're getting kind of eager and anxious for that. And, she goes down, at a conference meet, goes down on her knees, and she's in intense pain. And anyway, one thing led to the next. So she was really starting to fall in love with the sport, really starting to work. She was progressing, her confidence, more confidence as an individual. And one thing led to another. And in the course of 18 months, she had 3 knee scopes. That was just, it was devastation. It was devastation for her, myself, my wife. Um, but again, I tried not to be to the point to where, hey, I have high expectations because, I guess I always have, something in the back of my head, that, hey, a what if situation, and that's just one of many, that has happened. And I could think of, man, I walked in on, her and my daughter, and, you know, they're upset, crying, so forth and so on. My wife and I, same situation, we're asking all the questions, why. But, the gist of that situation was she was diagnosed with a bone disease, OCD, which is I'm going to butcher this, osteochondritis dissecans. And, yeah, in 18 months, she had 3 knee surgeries, 3 scopes. And, could never participate in high impact sports. Couldn't do a lot of stuff. And, it was devastation. It really was. And I know, some people think, hey, well, it's just sports and, this and, but we were really starting to see her, grow and build confidence, through sport, and that's one of the reasons why I love sports. It builds confidence, it builds character, amongst many other things. And that's just just a small example, that took place in our life. So, but I always try to have that, I guess, I don't know what you would call it, derailment, mindset of, hey, if this happens, and I think maybe it's a matter of me setting myself up for that, hey, okay, it's time to pivot, hey, emotionally detach, so that there's not an outburst, because at younger ages, I would emotionally lash out or burst or, whatever. So.
And that's a great example, because there's many times that the expectations we have aren't our own. It's expectations that we're projecting onto a whole nother situation and another person.
Sure.
And as a parent, that it's devastating when you see your child hurt, especially not just physically, but from the emotional standpoint of that she was excited, she was moving forward. She probably loved it because you loved it. And, there's that whole dynamic that continues to go on. So I would just challenge the listeners to think of, when you have an outburst or you have a sense of disappointment, what is it coming from? Is it coming from a disappointment of expectations? And I've shared this story before. Is one time, this was like during COVID, and we were supposed to go somewhere, and this was right when COVID hit, and we couldn't go. And I quickly I was going around the house. I was snipping at people. I was like just acting like a big baby. And so I took the dog for a walk, and I was like, why am I acting like this? Like, it was to the point where I realized that I was acting like a big baby. Sure. And it clicked when I was walking. I was like, oh, I'm disappointed. I really wanted to go, and now I don't get to go and do what I wanted to do, even though the whole family was coming with me. And it was the right decision to not go. And so I had to eat crow. I walked inside. I asked the family to come together. And I was like, hey, I'm sorry for the way I've been acting. I realize I'm acting this way because I'm just really disappointed. And so I think we have to have the ability and the courage to, even in front of our children, to admit some of those times when we are disappointed, when we do have improper expectations, because to me, that's a skill that we can pass down if we're strong enough to do that.
No, Jeff, honestly, that's, I couldn't agree with you more on that front. There's been, more than my own handful of times that, whether it was going to my son, daughter, wife, or even people at work, hey, I apologize because, I recognized, I was doing this, or this, and, it's not fair to you, and it's really not fair to, to anyone. And, being able to, bring that forth. And I really think that, people, see and recognize that, and, they respect that. And, that builds trust, that builds relationships. So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, John, the reason why I had you on, I got a tickle in my throat, sorry, is that you made a post on your anniversary, and it was a really, really good post. Do you mind if I read it? I mean, you put it out there for the whole world to see, yeah, so I guess you won't.
For sure.
And as soon as I read it, I reached out and I was like, I have to have you on the podcast. So whether or not we get to everything that I want to get to, and I don't have any questions, but I want to read it because it moved me in a sense that I'm a dad, you're a dad, and we have this opportunity to help others cultivate their pathways to greatness. So I'm going to stop talking and rambling and read it.
Okay.
So this was on March 14th. So congratulations on your anniversary. When this picture was taken 27 years ago, we had no idea what God had in store for us. But what we did know was that with his help, it was going to be a good ride, as it has been. Ain't gonna lie, at times it hasn't been easy. We made a commitment to each other. Not only that, but we made a commitment in front of God, which we strive to uphold every single day till death. Upon every struggle, I firmly believe we have become closer in our faith as Christians and our marriage. To this day, this woman is my best friend, a person that I can confide in not only as a spouse, but as a friend, a person that I trust my life and my children's life with. We challenge each other daily to make each other a better person. We strive to be a positive impact to those around us. With our 25-year-old daughter now in the early stages of raising her own family with her husband, and our soon-to-be 22-year-old son also embarking on the early stages of adulthood, we have been blessed. To those lives that we have touched and passed along the way, no matter if we're friends or enemies, thank you for making us a better couple because of the interaction with you. Happy 27 years, babe. Love you bunches. And then the scripture at the end is, haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied, they record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Matthew 19:4-6. And it just, when I read it, it really moved me, John. I mean, it's just a powerful testament to who you are as a man, as a husband and a father, and the impact that you've had on your family's life.
I appreciate that, man. That means a lot to me, Jeff. That's it says there at the beginning, when this picture was taken 27 years ago, I can't say that was the person that I was 27 years ago. But I could go several different ways. But our relationship has strengthened, year after year, struggle after struggle, positive impact after, negative impact, and, situation after situation. And that was one of the things that we had decided early was, we're in it to be in it. There is no exit plan. And, we also decided early on, that we would raise our family and have our family, we would be a Christian-based family. We would raise our kids in church, and, we go to church, and we're still, very active in the church. we teach a Sunday school class, and I'm a character coach with our youth pastor. Hang out with our the pastor of our church, on a daily basis, and yeah, I'm 100%, man.
Yeah. And what moved me was around, because I commented on there of just learning from you from a parent perspective. And I know the audience can as well, because I don't have a ton of listeners, but the listeners I know are parents. And I know that we could all benefit, because I'm a firm believer it's the people that you surround yourself with, and we all need coaches and mentors. And you're further along in the parenthood process than I am. And I appreciate that. My son's 16 and my daughter's 14. So you've lived through this that I'm in right now.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And the good thing is you're still here. So I know.
And they're still here.
Yes, exactly. It's a process, and boys are different than girls. 100%.
Yeah. You don't have to tell me that.
Yes. And I know that. I think that was another thing. And, so what I hope people hear is, before we get into it, is when you find people, and people like John are around us every single day. And if you don't take the time to have a conversation with someone to learn about them, and don't ask about the weather, don't ask about where they work, ask something more to find out who they are. Where they work and the weather has nothing to do with it. And I'm guilty as well.
Sure.
But that's what I love about social media. And I like the fact that you are very authentic to put this out there for that. So, the thoughts that I have is, as we're trying to raise our children and point them in the right direction, what are some piece of advice that, you would give me, that I have a son going into his senior year in high school. My daughter's going into her freshman year of high school. And it's almost like that question that goes back of, if you could go back and tell yourself something, where I'm in the stage that I'm in, even if for you it'd be flipped, the daughter's older than the son.
Sure.
What are some things that you would give yourself advice around those critical years?
So one of the things that I always say whenever someone asks me, if you were to go back, and I have a couple of reasons why I answer it in this manner. And a lot of people, I get an eye roll, or, hey, there's got to be more. But I always tell them that if I was to go back and do it again, I would do it the way that I did it. The reason why is because, from day one, I wasn't raising my son to be a boy. I was raising him to be a man. And I knew at some point in time, my wife and I, we met between my sophomore and junior year in high school. So, high school sweethearts, married, raised kids, struggles, so forth and so on. But I always say that I would do it the same because of the information that I had at the time. And I feel like that I tried to raise them for more every step of the way. I knew, like I said, I knew at some point in time, my son, would meet, the love of his life, and, she would probably depend on him, because that's biblical. But, I also showed him what it looked like, to be, a father. I always strive to be there for their games, their programs, their practices. I always tried to be there and be present. Same thing with my daughter, be present. If there was some things that I would change, as far as around her, I would be more empathetic with her, because I think there were some times with her that, I probably wasn't as much as what maybe I could have or should have been. And, I do feel that, maybe that was a shortcoming. But I always tried to make sure that, hey, they understood that, we have some parents that, hey, I'm their friend. I try to be their friend. Um, I could be their friend, but I was their dad, you know, and, any accountability in the family or, any, family rules or whatever, it's up to me to hold them accountable, so I'm all about, being friends with them, but you have to be more than friends with them. So that would probably be one disclaimer is, yeah, you can be their friend, but you're their parent, so make sure, you're raising them in that manner, to be their parent. Um, I raised my son completely different than I raised my daughter, and these are conversations that my wife and I, we have or had, and they got pretty deep at times, because the questions of, why, why are you like that? Why are you like that? Well, because he's a boy and I was a boy and I know what boys do, type of thing. And I did, there was times to where, you know, I purposely raised him different. I try to show my daughter, what what a dad in a family looked like, whether it was, being there for her whenever she was going through her 3 surgeries in 18 months or, schoolwork, or, hey, what's it look like to be, you know, a strong parental figure, to take a stand for, hey, this is what our family does, type of stuff. So hopefully some of that makes sense.
It does. And thank you for sharing that. And the things that I gathered, one is the don't be their friend. You can be, it's hard to hear that for a lot of people and me at the same time. And I made a post in my story the other day is parenting is trying to protect our kids from our own faults and self-esteem issues, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's just something around is like I'm projecting everything that I struggle with usually onto my kids, and so I've got to protect them from those things. And so to your point of knowing your standards and then living them, and that's what I heard is that you knew your wife and I were your wife and I, you and your wife were equally yoked in how you were going to raise your family. And that's super important is that you have to be a good team, and then surrounding yourself with the right people is important as well. The other thing that I got from it is laying expectations. Like you said, is that you set expectations of this is how our family operates.
Sure.
And if you're outside those lines, not really my fault. We've been very clear of this is the way we are and this is the way we're going to do things.
Yep.
And it's tough, but like you said, is you're raising them to be more. And I really like that phrase. And I hope people hear that because one, that's critical for parenting. I think it's critical for the people that you surround yourself with and the people that are around you is that you have to expect more, but not in an unhealthy way. What
Sure.
I got from what you had shared as well is that, you're quick to correct, but it's because you love them, because you know that there's going to be a day where they're not with you and you have to feel comfortable that you've helped set them up to make good decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. There was times, you can say calculated, I was pretty calculated, whenever we were raising our kids, whenever they were going through, their elementary, middle school, high school ages. Uh, an example, with my son, played football, um, excelled, pretty decent. Um, but he done some boy stuff, I think he was a sophomore or junior, and he done some boy stuff. And I was always also I was the grade checker, so I checked the grades. And there would only be certain times that I would talk to them, about grades or pretty much any topic that would create emotion. So, if my son was getting ready to walk out the door, going to, whether it be a JV or a varsity football game, I would not talk to him about anything that would create emotion. I wouldn't talk to him about grades. I wouldn't talk to him, about, um, anything that would cause excess emotion on him because, you know, some parents may agree or disagree, but he's getting ready to go play a football game to where there's going to be all types of emotion that he's going to embark on, you know. So it would either be, like a Sunday evening. Sunday evenings would typically be the time to, hey, we need to talk about the week. We would talk about the previous week and then we would talk about the next week, if it was about grades. Now if it was outside of a season, yeah, fair game. Man, I'd print out I don't know what you all use in Orlando, but we use Teacher Ease. But I'd print out all the Teacher Ease reports, and the meme it's or the video about hey, they haven't entered it yet, the teacher hasn't put it in yet. I mean, he used that all the time. They both did. But we would, I would bring him home and I would lay him out on the table and hey, what do we need to do to get this up, or to get this turned in, or to do this or to do that. And that's just one example, grades. But yeah, I always try to talk to them, hey, how was your day, how was your week. I'm not going to say that we were a regular family or dinner at the table family, but we were still always together, and I always talk to him, hey, how was your day? How was this class? How was this class? Knowing that I had checked Teacher Ease and, maybe there was some grades or something that hasn't been turned in or reported. So I would always ask questions around stuff. And I was an extremely, an extreme advocate of, hey, I have all your social media passwords. There was some that we wouldn't let him get onto until a certain age. And, specifically my son, not so much my daughter because she was a little bit older, but more my son than my daughter because of when they got phones, at 9:00, it was ours. He didn't sleep with it. They didn't have TVs in their bedrooms, and yeah, all that type of stuff.
So, yeah, and what I hear is protect. I mean, you're protecting kids from themselves because they just have it. I mean, they just don't have that capacity yet to kind of know how to throttle themselves back.
I can see where one would use the word protect. I used it more for maybe just awareness, because, hey, if you're not using, social media the right way, you're going to find out stuff that you don't want to find out, initially, type of stuff. So I can see to where you would use protect, or one would use the word protect.
Yeah. And the other parts that I heard is you probably, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but so I'll stop, is, from the level of explanation of results, how deep did you get into explaining kind of that if this then that type scenarios?
Meaning,
like if you do this, and it doesn't necessarily mean social media, but from a parenting perspective of if you drive fast, you'll get a speeding ticket, or if you do this, did you go into the why behind? Just, it's not just you can't do that. Well, why? Because I said so. Like, that doesn't go and carry water at all.
I was never a big advocate of I said so. Now there would be times, and those times of because I said so would always come after, hey, we talked about this. It's been discussed. I have thoroughly explained to you, you know, the reason, you know, the background. And if you're not going to understand any of that, because at the end of the day, I'm your dad and I'm telling you, we're not doing this, you know. So eventually those would come. Um, but the earlier that we had those conversations, the fewer those situations arose, because it was like, okay, you know, he said this, so, you know, we're not, you know, type of thing. But yeah, there'd be times where, and, you know, sometimes my son, daughter, and wife, you know, kind of, you know, laugh at me now, because it was like, what was the terms that would use? Everything's oh, I'm missing the word. You know, everything's a trial, or everything's an event, you know, and I would always talk about it, you know. Um, but yeah, anytime that it would ever arise, you know, hey, because I said so, it was because, hey, we've talked about this. We talked about it again. And, you know, this was all explained to you. And we talked about it one more time. And if you're not going to pay attention to any of that, then, because at the end of the day, I'm your dad. And this is what we're doing. So,
Yeah. And it goes back to the trigger part too, that you were talking about, is that
sure.
if you're emotionally triggered, you can't come across as a good leader and as a father to be able to explain yourself well. I've found, for me, it's like if you just holler, nobody's listening. I don't listen if somebody yells and screams. So it's more of that, all right, let's sit down. We've talked about this. Let's go through that. And
Yeah.
so it's good to hear that you say that, because it is important, you know, no matter who you're speaking with, but especially your kids and your spouse, is to know where you're at on that. If we use the traffic light analogy, is,
Sure.
you know, you probably at this moment would be living in the yellow, but you can still be under control and have that ability to be able to communicate and express yourself effectively to the other person can receive it.
Yep. Yep.
Now, when you look at like the 27 years that you guys have been married, and it sounds like you've been together a lot longer, and you're navigating now a different stage of parenting, because as my dad always said, is that you know, you never get rid of your kids until you die. So you're parenting, so you're kind of in that adulthood phrase. How do you transition from them being under your roof, you having those conversations like you've had, to now all of a sudden is they're their own adult now, and I've got to be respectful of that?
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the reasons is because a lot of people look at that different ways. Um, you know, I love my kids, and you know, I was a little hurt, you know, when they moved out, but you know, obviously, you know, hey, it comes to that point. Um, you know, you have some parents that, you know, they say you never stop raising your kids. Um, I do believe you stop raising your kids, and I believe that you have to stop raising your kids at some point in time, because they become their own individuals, and you have to give them, you know, that respect in their families to become those individuals. Um, so, yeah, my son, he'll be 22 this summer, and he moved out, you know, last year when he turned 21. My daughter, I honestly can't remember when she moved out now, but she's been out for, I believe it's going on 2.5 years now, 2.5, 3 years. And I always told them that 25 was the exit plan age. If they were not out at 25, then we would, you know, we would be working to a point that at 25 or shortly after, for them to, you know, find a place. And I believe that, my personal opinion, I believe that that has to be done. One, because at the end of the day, you marry your spouse for them. You don't marry it for your kids. Yeah, you hope to, have kids, raise kids, and, go through that whole entire journey of raising kids, which is, it's a God's blessing, to do that. But at some point in time, um, you know, you ultimately marry your spouse to spend your life with your spouse. So as we've transitioned, you know, my granddaughter, she's going on, I think she's getting close to 8 months now. So we've become more now of a support system for her and my son-in-law. Um, you know, hey, mom, dad, I need this, or can you watch, her, or so forth and so on. You know, hey, can you do this for us? Yeah, absolutely. For my son, he's in a little bit different stage because he's living alone. He just lives here in town. He is dating a great girl from northern Illinois, which is about 5 hours away. And the future is telling us that he may be moving north. We don't know this for sure. But she comes from a extremely, tight family, which is great. And, we raised him to be independent, strong, so forth and so on. So there may be a possibility that he could relocate up there. So that'll be extremely different. But right now for him, hey man, I'm just his, you know, hey man, have a great day. I text him. If I don't text him daily, I text him every other day. He calls every evening, checks in. It's more like a young adult, support, encouragement is what we are for him. For my daughter, hey, she has a full-time job. My son-in-law, he's got a full-time job. We're just, hey, if you need anything, we're here, type of thing. But yeah, it's probably more of a supporting role, because we drilled in pretty hard and heavy on, hey, here's what it looks like to be a person of character and integrity. Again, raised them in church. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, but it's
all makes great sense. That's why I'm just sitting here quiet.
we're probably more at, supporting them in their young adulthood. But we don't. So funny story. My wife, she gets to the point, she's like, hey, he pays his truck payment, and then he has another payment that he pays, but he's pretty well self-sufficient. But she was bound and determined to get him off of our cell phone plan. Well, anybody that knows anything about cell phones, the more phones that you have in the plan, the cheaper it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
So we go to the local, cell phone store, and, she's explaining to the individual, hey, he wants his own plan, blah, blah, blah. And, the question arose, hey, I don't mean to be rude, but like, you realize it's cheaper if he stays on your plan. So the deal was worked out between the two, and he's still on our cell phone plan. But it just makes sense, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So
well, like when you were talking, what it sounds like is that as your kids get older, you transition from a parent into a mentor. Even though you've always mentored them, you're not parenting them anymore. You just, like you said, you want to be there as a support system that you hope you've built that trust and that bond through parenting that allows them to see, all right, my parents are a valued resource that if I have something, I'm going to go ask them because I know they're going to give me good counsel. Is that
Yep,
accurate?
For sure. Yeah, my son come to me, man, it was I forget how long he's had it now. maybe a year and a half, 2 years, he come to me and he's like, "Hey, I want a new vehicle." And I'm like, "Well, let's sit down and we'll look at your finances, and we'll see what that looks like." So we went through everything, and I'm always try to be a big advocate of, hey, save X amount, do this and do this with this, and then take whatever you have left, and then we'll see what's possible. So he was with me through that whole exercise, pointing it out to him, you know, hey, here's what you bring home, here's your, flexible monies, if you will, that you can take and do what you want with, and, walked it through. And then, we went to go look, and, he ended up getting, what he wanted, and he was able to, pay for it, and still have, money to spare, if you will. So for his own. And then we've done the same thing, with my son-in-law, my daughter, whether it's going over to, do some help, on their house, or, go through finances as well. But yeah, more of like 100%, like a mentoring type role, and never trying to be, hey, you need to do this, type of individual, or to be the type of individual that would be, demanding, for them to go one way or the other. But I believe in, hey, if there's something that I know that may, derail them, or that could, benefit them, then it's on me to let them know. I have to let them know. And I'm a big advocate of that as well. Hey, if I know, whether I've experienced it or I know about it, let them know. And then at the end of the day, hey, it is your decision to make, in whatever that course is. But yeah, it's for sure 100% a mentor type role.
And what I like about it is when you go back to something that you said earlier in the conversation, is that you raised your kids for more. You weren't raising a boy, you weren't raising a girl, you're raising a man and a woman, which leads them to the point where they are today. And so the message that I took from it, and it'd be interesting what the audience would say if they did, is that you've got to keep your sight further down the road. It's just like when you're driving, if you look right in front of the car, you steer too much, but if you look, 50 yards ahead, you keep your steering wheel straight, and you know the direction that you're going. And so that's what I took from it, is to make sure that we're raising our kids for more. And we always say that, but are our actions aligned with that we're saying?
Sure. Yeah. Jeff, one of the analogies that I use is that you have to progress through life with a microscope and a telescope. So, you're looking through the microscope, and, hey, this is today, could be, a week or so, a month or so. And then, the telescope ultimately is looking out to, hey, what's the end game goal? And the end game goal was, I wanted both of them to be productive members of society. My son's only going to play football for so long. Even if he would have went to college and played football, it's still a small window, in the grand scheme of things. Same thing with my daughter. If she would have, went on to play volleyball, and, even high school, it's just a small, minute time, if you will, in their life. And the ultimate end game goal, for both of them was to become, productive members of society, and all that entails, that's just a finite, descriptor, but
yeah. Well, we have to have goals, and
sure.
we have to know how to align to those. And again, I want everybody to hear what you've been saying is you have to know your values. You have to have a standard, and then that's a non-negotiable standard, because if you say you have values and a standard, but yet you don't live in them, and you constantly are wavering left or right, then they're not really values or a standard. They're just something you're saying to make yourself feel good.
Yeah. Or, I mean, let's just go back to, more of a, I'll say like a worldly topic. Whatever my son was, I believe he was probably about 7 or 8. I quit chewing. I chewed smokeless tobacco. I literally chewed smokeless tobacco for probably 30 years prior to quitting. And one of the reasons I quit was because I didn't want him to chew. I didn't want him around it. Talk about alcohol. We didn't keep alcohol in the house. I was against it. Now, let's just be honest with ourselves. At some point in time when kids, get into middle school and high school age, hey man, that's when they're first exposed to those, I'll say those, drugs or whatever. I know, at the age of, we're probably going back to 7th and 8th grade. There were stories about, children my son's age, going to, parties and stuff like that, so, full transparency, man, all those, that was all used, in raising, my children. So, but
yeah, man, I appreciate it. I just looked at the time, and I want to be very respectful of your time, because I could sit here and ask a ton of questions. So I'm going to constantly be reaching out. But,
Sure.
John, what would you say are something that you'd like to leave the audience with today about, all the different things that we've spoken about?
I mean, if we just talk about kids, the biggest thing that I could say is, man, embrace the journey. Have fun raising them. It can be a very stressful time. And again, depending on, how many you have. But just embrace that journey. It's a journey, and, be intentional in their lives. If you're not, society will gladly raise your children, but they may not end up the way that you want them to, so be intentional. Then as far as, we talked about, my wife and I, again, the same thing. Never stop dating your spouse. Always make sure they know that you love them, and, that you care for them. And then, we just talking about, from an individual perspective, be susceptible to change, be willing to change. So constant improvement.
Yeah, for sure. Well, man, thank you for all of that. I got so much. And honestly, for me, the big takeaway was raise your kids for something more. That really resonated with me. And I feel like I've been doing that, but I can do a better job. And so it's timely. I'm grateful. I'm glad that you answered my comment and were so willing and able to come on. So I'm grateful. So John, hang tight a little bit. But everybody, this has been a wonderful conversation with John Horn, and I'm grateful. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for joining us on the Pathways to Greatness podcast. We hope that today's conversation inspired you to take steps towards your own greatness. Remember, every journey starts with a single step. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might benefit. Actually, share it with 3 people that you might think it might benefit. Until next time, keep pursuing your passions and carving your own path to greatness. Take care.